Yeah, it might have been. I mean, it's pretty fancy stuff.
It had to be done on a machine.
You're the art person. I don't know.
That might have been one of Bill Capshaw's famous
Well,
designs.
this is true. My wife has always wanted to take one of his classes.
I'd be afraid to.
I worked with a lady, she's since passed. She used to drive school bus for Oak Ridge, and she had the Scarborough area.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this little boy that would get on her bus, and he would draw. And at a very young age, he was very talented, and she told him, to pursue that. It was Bill Capshaw. And then later on, when Bill joined the plant, she worked for Bill. It's kind of interesting how the world twists and bends and turns.
Yeah, like I say, it's a small world, but I wouldn't want to paint it. It wasn't Bill Capshaw, but there was, when I was in high school, there was a guy named Capshaw, which might have been a relative or something like that.
Mm.
I taught his niece. She was extremely gifted.
Okay, well, Bill Capshaw's niece. Okay, well, this Capshaw was the meanest person in the school.
I hope it wasn't the father then.
I hope that kind of football season they had a suit for him.
Oh, no, he was one of these guys that,
Yeah.
first game he'd be thrown out and suspended for them.
I'd love to take a course like that, but I'd be afraid to because I spent a whole semester throwing clay onto a wheel and it coming off. Threw it and came off. Threw it and came off.
I heard you were doing something wrong. I'm not sure what, but
My teacher said, "You're doing that on purpose." No, I'm not.
well,
I could have pursued
well,
I could have pursued something else, jewelry making or something.
there you go.
I would have loved to have done some lost wax casting.
What are you talking about? Kid being able to draw. My grandson's 8 years old and he can draw so well, but he only likes to draw dinosaurs and Godzilla. So he's got a pretty limited range.
Well, they all
He must
go
be
through the
second grade,
dinosaur
right?
stage.
Huh?
About second grade?
Yeah.
That's dinosaur year.
Well, he's been into dinosaurs for some time.
Right, but that's the year. That's the year they study them in school.
Let's see if
I know other little boys that draw really well and only draw cars.
yeah.
Are they close, or is your daughter still out in?
No,
team
she's
sport?
there in Knoxville.
Oh,
How
okay.
nice.
Hey guys.
Hey,
Somewhere I have one of his better. More
You can have a hard cup there, Brandon, if you want.
That's okay.
I have to wash the coffee pot, so a few dishes, that doesn't matter.
We're gonna wish it.
Every couple of months he washes the coffee pot and the cups.
I just say leave it. It gets good and seasoned like a grill, you know.
This fine coffee that Rick brings in, it's just a great disservice to put it in a styrofoam cup.
Hair of the lizard.
I won't do it again.
that's not what it's called, hair of the lizard. Is it? No, it's called dragons.
Komodo dragon.
That's almost as bad. Komodo.
Is that the coffee?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's 10 o'clock already.
This is his.
Oh, very nice. Very nice.
Yeah, that's his dog.
That's a gift for a kid that age, because a lot of kids are still doing stick figures.
Well, it's showtime. Class begins.
My bell.
We need to get the riffraff out.
Oh, shut the door, would you please?
I'll get it. I'm closer now.
You aren't blessed with Adrian and Carrie this morning. That's unusual.
I know it is. They're not here. Joey, I don't know. She always comes in a few minutes after the hour, so.
And
They wanted us to shut the doors.
I saw Jenny pull up.
But I wonder if we need curtains or something in the window.
I don't know. I don't think this views the door. Well, it does, but I watched the YouTube video for a moment. Yeah, it does just get the window. I watched the last week's YouTube video for like 5 seconds just to see if I, to hear and you could hear the machine. They're not going right now, so.
I'm surprised it picks up that noise.
It picks it up louder on that than I feel like we hear it, sitting in here. I guess just the way the receiver works for the microphone there, but.
Here
Oh,
we go.
speak of the devil. Here she are.
Hey,
Hey.
so
Speak
glad
of
you're
the
here.
angel.
Is Gary here?
No, I was having such problems. I had to stop and get gas. And the gas pump was just not being nice.
Price wise or,
Either way, all of the above.
It's,
yeah.
it's going down a little bit though. It was $3.99 at Gas Mart this morning when I drove by.
We've got a Baptist class here.
And Sam's had it for $3.74 yesterday when we were there. So if you feel
Wow.
like waiting in line and you're a Sam's Club member, it's a pretty good deal.
That is, yeah.
I filled up there last week. All right, we'll do announcements as usual before we get into Sunday school class. There's something new on here. First Baptist Church Fabulous Book Club, the FBC. Who thought of that one and how much time they spent? First meeting is August 1st. So I guess this is the book club meeting that we've talked about in over the past month or two. But now they've given it this clever little name. So it says if you haven't, oh no, this is something new, I guess. This is so it says if you want to participate or not sure or have any questions, to contact Diane May via phone or email. August fellowship table is scheduled for Friday the 12th. As usual in the fellowship hall, it'll be from 12 to 1. It says come as early as 11:30. And more importantly, what is the food? Stuffed chicken breast. That sounds really good. Save the seat. So stuffed chicken breast for the fellowship table this month. That's Friday, August the 12th. That's from noon to 1 p.m. down in the fellowship hall. $5 a ticket. They'll be on sale in the narthex, I guess today. Well, no. Next weekend. Next Sunday. Noisy offering is August 14th. So this time, I guess people have asked, for something maybe we could do to help directly help the people of Ukraine. And so this noisy offering is going to go to the Ukraine Relief Fund, served by the CBF field personnel. So I guess they have a Ukraine Relief Fund that they're managing. And it says beyond that, support will be directed to the Baptist World Alliance Forum for Aid Development. And that's the International Disaster Response work for, CBF partners at Baptist World Alliance. And it says that they're working actively with leaders in Ukraine, Baptist leaders, church leaders in Ukraine, to identify the most, essential needs that the people have there, and just trying to distribute the resources as efficiently as possible. So that'll be our noisy offering. That's where it's going. And again, that's on the 14th. And it's just another repeat of the trustees cleaning up, and they're repairing some areas inside the facility. And so if you want to donate directly to that through your offering, you can donate to the facility renovations account. And they continue to clean up, but we're also working on some repairs. So that's where the money's coming into play. All right. Let's pray, and then we'll do Sunday school. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for another opportunity to gather together in your name. We thank you for this new classroom, and just everything going on around here, Lord, the improvements and the movement and all the adjustments, they're all good things, and we just thank you for these blessings. We pray for the worship services today, not only ours, but also for First Christian upstairs, that you would make this transition a good thing for them, and that they don't have too much trouble making that transition, Lord, and just help us to be there for them, to help them and support them as they go through this. And we just ask that you be each of us today as we come and go. You know our struggles, you know our hearts. Guide us and lead us and direct us. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So last week we started discussing, some of the standard arguments against the existence of God. Before we wrap up this talk on natural theology, which was focused on arguments for the existence of God from, natural theology, we didn't want to end without considering some of the arguments that are popularly, given against the existence of God. And so this week we're going to continue that discussion, and we're going to move in what is probably, at least I think, and what's probably the most, common objection or argument lodged against the existence of God, and that's the argument from suffering and evil in the world. This is often in literature, or if you're reading online, called the problem of evil, or as C.S. Lewis coined it, the problem of pain. So just to, those things will be used synonymously when you're reading, but I'm just gonna describe it as the problem of suffering in the world, just to kind of stick with one term so that it's not confusing. And this argument isn't merely about, moral evil or just the evils that humans inflict upon humans or upon the world, animals and that sort of thing. It's bigger than that. And what I think is more difficult to explain is all the natural evil in the world. The suffering that results from disease, from natural disasters, from just plain accidents, and that sort of thing. So, when it comes to moral evil, or what the evil that humans inflict upon, other people or the world in general, we can point to free will. But what can be said of all the suffering and death that result from natural evil? It's not hard, it's really just not hard to wonder where God is when these things happen. Why doesn't God prevent some of these things that at least appear from our perspective to just be unnecessary and meaningless almost? I think that, why doesn't God prevent these sorts of things? I think we can all agree that when you consider the incredible amount of human suffering in the world, especially those instances that just seem, again, like unnecessary. It just didn't have to happen. It wasn't the result of some person making an evil decision. It almost does seem like, we talked about this last week, I can see in those cases why some people may think it does seem like evidence of absence when it comes to an all-powerful, all-loving, God. As I said last week, this is probably the most powerful argument for, in support of atheism, not because of its intellectual power, but because of its emotional power. And it's important that we make that distinction right from the get-go. The intellectual problem of suffering is concerned with whether or not it is plausible that the all-powerful, all-good God of Christianity is compatible with a world filled with suffering. In contrast to the intellectual problem is the emotional problem of evil. And the emotional problem, or the emotional problem of suffering. I said I was going to stick to one term, and now I'm having a hard time doing it. In contrast to the intellectual problem is the emotional problem of suffering. And this deals with, essentially deals with people's dislike of a God who would permit suffering. So the distinction there is very important. Without it, you kind of run the risk of trying to resolve an emotional problem with, intellectual answers. And I can tell you from personal experience, this is not a good strategy. Just in talking with, a friend or my wife or someone who's upset emotionally, and when intellectual answers, to those sorts of struggles can just feel very dry and uncaring to the person that's going through them. That's people who are struggling with emotional problems need comfort and encouragement, not rationalizations as to why they are struggling in the first place. It's been a very hard lesson for me. On the other hand, someone who isn't dealing with emotional problems, or who isn't, dealing with the emotional problem of suffering, but maybe they're just pondering, the problem of suffering purely from a philosophical, standpoint. That person isn't going to find answers to the emotional problem to be of much value. So it's important to keep those two problems distinct, especially as we, carry out, addressing these things and the questions that the struggles that come about from the suffering in the world. As Dr. Craig points out, the intellectual problem of suffering lies in the province of the philosopher, and the emotional problem of suffering lies in the province of, the pastoral counselor, or someone who's acting, in that way as a counselor. And it's the emotional problem of suffering that you're most likely to encounter when talking to people. That's typically going to be what it is. Such a person may feel like their objections to the existence of God or to God, being all loving, they may feel like their objections are intellectual, but, when in fact it's emotional. It's typically a rejection of God rather than a refutation of God, and those two things are different, right? And when I was writing this lesson, what immediately popped into my head when I got to this point was I recalled this interview that was done some years ago with the British or English actor Stephen Fry. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Stephen Fry. If you're not familiar with him, what I knew of him before, but what I know of him now, I know him best is he played the Master of Lake Town in the second Hobbit film, The Desolation of Smaug. If you've seen that, he was just awful. He played the character so well. He was just a terrible dude. The character was, not Stephen Fry. But anyway, if you haven't seen that, never mind. But if you have, that's Stephen Fry. He's this large, booming man. He's very intelligent. I've seen interviews with him since then on YouTube with, like Jordan Peterson and, talking philosophy. And he's a very smart, intelligent guy. But yeah, anyway, years ago there was this interview with Stephen Fry, and he spoke very emotionally about a God who would create a world with so much suffering, and so this is what he said. I wrote it down from the video. He said, "How dare you?" This is what he would say to this God, to who Christians call God, basically. He said, "How dare you? How dare you create?" And he says this with this snobby-ish British accent, so you can kind of picture it in your mind. "How dare you create a world to which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world that is so full of injustice and pain?" That's what I would say. Now, if I died and it was Pluto, Hades, or the 12 Greek gods, then I would have more truck with it, because the Greeks didn't pretend to not be human in their appetites, in their capriciousness, and in their unreasonableness. They didn't present themselves as being all-seeing, all-wise, all-kind, all-beneficent, because the God that created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac, an utter maniac, and totally selfish. So that's what Stephen Fry had to say about the idea of the existence of an all-good, all-loving God and the suffering that we see in the world. And he finished it all. He says, "And we have to spend our life on our knees thanking him. What kind of God would do that?" And again, he said this in a very emotive way. You didn't get the idea that his opinion was up for debate or that he was open for questioning. And this sort of thing is quite popular among atheists. I remember this argument getting slung around in articles and stuff, and people just thought it was basically this just knockdown argument against God because there's suffering in the world. But it's popular not because it's a knockdown argument, but against God's existence. Rather, it just questions why anyone should even worship such an entity if he does exist. It's not denying his existence per se, but that he would even be worthy of worship. But this is a prime example, again, of rejecting God rather than offering a refutation of God's existence. It's just wanting nothing to do with a God who allows people to suffer. But again, I'd wager that most people who reject God in this way do believe their objection is intellectual, even though it is, in fact, emotional. So it's worth talking about the intellectual problem of suffering in order to get at the real issue. Now, there's a couple of different versions of the intellectual argument. There's the logical problem of suffering, which says there's a logical inconsistency between the existence of God and the suffering in the world. The logical version says that if God exists, then suffering cannot exist. since suffering does exist, God doesn't exist. That would be the logical problem. In contrast, there's the evidential problem, and this is the one you're more likely to encounter. The evidential problem of suffering doesn't make the claim that God and suffering are logically inconsistent or incompatible. Rather, it argues that it's just highly improbable that if, God exists, then there would be so much suffering as we see in the world. And so given that we do see so much suffering in the world, the argument would go that it's improbable that God exists. We'll start with the we'll start with the logical problem. Here the atheist will claim that an all-powerful, all-loving God exists. If an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, then suffering in the world would not exist. It just, you can't have an all-powerful, all-loving God and suffering. That's what this argument would be. The two are incompatible. And since there is clearly suffering in the world, God doesn't exist. So the first question that needs to be asked here is why think that the existence of an all-powerful, all-loving God is logically inconsistent with the suffering that we see in the world, or with suffering in general? There is no obvious contradiction here. Between these two things existing in the world. So in making this argument, the atheist it must be making at least one, or I think a couple of assumptions, hidden assumptions, that would introduce an actual contradiction between God's existence and the existence of suffering. So the two hidden assumptions seem to be, one, that an all-powerful God can create any world that he wants, and two, that an all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering. So those seem to be kind of the two hidden assumptions in making this claim that the existence of God and the existence of suffering are logically inconsistent with one another. So it seems the argument assumes that if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, then he both can and would create a world without suffering. Both of these assumptions would have to be necessarily true in order for the existence of God and the existence of suffering to be logically inconsistent. But are those two statements necessarily true? Let's think about the first one. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. Is that necessarily true? I don't think so. You might recall that something we've discussed before. The answer just would be no. Just because God is all-powerful, that does not entail that he could create anything that he wants, or that he could just create anything. Because what if it's a world where it's possible, at least, that the creatures of that world have free will? It is not logically possible to make someone do something freely. That's a logical impossibility. So God's being all-powerful doesn't mean he can do the logically impossible. There's actually no such thing as the logically impossible. It's just words we reference. It's just words we use to reference something that cannot be. That's what that is. So it's not as we're not putting a limitation on God by saying that he can't do the logically impossible, because the logically impossible just is something that cannot be. I hope you understand that. We're just pointing out that God can't do things that aren't even real things to begin with. So God's being all-powerful doesn't mean he can do logically impossible things, such as making someone freely do something. So if it's possible that people have freedom of the will, which we believe that we do, then it's not necessarily true that an all-powerful God can create any world that he wants, since people endowed with free will may refuse to do what God desires. In fact, it could even be the case that in a world where people have free will, in any world that God creates where people have free will, that there would be just as much suffering in any of those worlds as there is in the actual world. It may be that our world, the actual world, has the greatest amount of good, along with, despite the fact that people have free will and can choose to do evil things. I'm not saying that's true, but it could be. Who knows? So anyway, as long as it's logically possible that people have freedom of the will, it's just not necessarily true that God can create just any world that he wants. So that defeats, the first assumption there, that an all-powerful God can create anything that he wants. Yes, AJ.
But he could create a world where we don't have free will and therefore all is possible. I mean, he didn't have to give us free will.
Right. That's true. He could create. Yes, you're right.
We
God.
could be puppets.
God could have created a world where we don't have free will and we are just essentially like puppets, as Linda said, and then there's no suffering. But is that world preferable? So that's
That's
you
not
know,
what you asked, though.
that's when you have to start. That's when you have to. Well, what we're asking is,
Is it possible?
Is it
Well,
logic-
it is possible. He could have, but then we wouldn't have everything we have.
right. We're just saying here for this argument, is it logically inconsistent for God to exist and a world, with suffering in it to exist? And the answer is, I think, clearly no. And if we didn't have free will, that, sure, God could have just made us to where we don't do anything to bring about our own suffering. That doesn't really answer the problem of natural evil, but it does. You could clear up the problem of the problem of moral evil that people commit on one another. But then
even natural evil would be eliminated because we wouldn't have any bad genes, and everybody would be born perfect.
Well, what about earthquakes and
And
tsunamis?
And
And the rain in Kentucky.
okay,
And the
so
rain in Kentucky.
what caused it? It's probably because of something we did that messed up what he created in the first place.
Yeah, well, we can't
we
prove
put
that.
pollution in there. So we don't know if we caused it.
There may be. I admit, there may be some climate
And
issues
if
that we
everything
cause,
was
but
perfect, he wouldn't. He probably would have said, "We're going to have so many days of rain. We're going to have so many days of sunshine." And you would know when those are going to be because everything was as he designed it.
it's just like
The
domino.
Dust Bowls in Kentucky are a good example. Not Kentucky, in the center of the United States.
Mhm.
It's a good example of things we created that caused.
Sure. Yeah, there is some.
natural.
Yeah, there's some climate related things that I'm sure that we were responsible for influencing in some way, but it seems that for whatever reason, which would be a different discussion, God did not see a world full of people that He just made them do everything as desirable. What does that do for things like love? And that doesn't seem like love would just be something you're programmed to do, not something you actually
Right.
do.
Felt.
Yes. So, anyway, as long as it's logically possible that people have freedom of the will, that people can freely choose to, go against God's desires for them, it's not necessarily true that God can create just any sort of, world. Again, that's what we ended with. So that defeats that first assumption. So then what about the second assumption, that if God is all loving or all good, that He would prefer a world without suffering? Is that necessarily true? It sounds easy to say, well, yeah, if God's all loving and all good, He prefers a world with no suffering. Okay, well, I don't think it's obviously true, though. What if God has good reasons for allowing the suffering in the world? And this one's, if we think about this, this one's easy to think through. I think we can see that there are cases when permitting or even inflicting suffering achieves a greater good. In his book, A Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis wrote, "What do people mean when they say I am not afraid of God because I know He is good? Have they never been to the dentist?" And so what C.S. now remember, Lewis is writing this back in the time when there was no topical anesthetics and that sort of thing when you went and got dental work. So there's no Novocaine yet. Yikes. So I don't know. It would, but what he's getting at is that going to the. I mean, even today though. I mean, my dentist has this. My new dentist has this way of cleaning the teeth that doesn't use the brush with the little motor. Instead, it uses it's like a pressure washer, a real small microscopic pressure washer. Well, not microscopic, but you know what I mean. It's water just cleaning. there's a couple of places when that, usually getting my teeth cleaned, I've always loved it. It's an enjoyable, this is not always enjoyable because there's a couple of parts where my teeth are just sensitive. I don't have any, gum or tooth decay issues there, but they're just sensitive. And when that water hits it, I get that little jolt and I don't like it. Anyway, that made me think of that whenever I was looking up where C.S. Lewis wrote this. I remembered the quote, but I couldn't remember the book, and it drives me crazy. I hate to quote somebody without a citation. So anyway, but what he's getting at is that going to the dentist and getting your teeth worked on, and even my example was just to show even today with all of the sedatives and anesthetics and stuff that we have, it may come with some amount of suffering and maybe even a pretty terrible amount of temporary suffering, but there's this overriding good that makes that suffering worth it, right? To have a healthy mouth and teeth and gums and that sort of thing. I mean, that's going to that stuff can kill you if you don't if it's left untreated. So what he's getting at that this is just an example of there can be an overriding good that's achieved through suffering. And so it's simply not true that a world without suffering is automatically better than a world with suffering. And we're not trying to, God is no mere dentist. We're not trying to say that. But it could still be the case, and what Lewis was getting at, is that it could still be the case that, that God allows at least some of the world's suffering because it contributes to some sort of overriding good. Which, seems, we can even see that on our level. So,
Well, when you think about childbirth,
right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes that's.
it can be very painful, but
yes.
You're bringing
That's
life into the world,
That's an even better example. Childbirth. I didn't even think of that, but I mean, yeah, that's. I know there's degrees. Some people don't have a whole lot of. There's not much suffering for some women to go through that, and for others, there's tremendous amounts. So that's another good example.
To me, it comes down to purpose. Suffering makes you stronger. It increases your wisdom. It does a lot of personal things to you.
Yeah.
That make you a stronger and better person. And I kind of believe that my God's purpose for me in this life is to become the strongest and best person that I can possibly be.
Yeah.
And suffering is part of that.
I agree. I like how you put that. I've been using these words. There's some sort of overriding good, but I like how there can be purpose. There can be a purpose, meaning, and value, and I mean those all in positive ways, like you just said. Purpose, meaning, and value that comes through suffering, such as you said.
If this life is just preparation for the life after, which we believe as Christians,
yeah,
then all the suffering and all the bad things that occur in this world are there to help us all become
sure
the strongest and best people we can be.
Yeah.
To prepare us for the next life.
Yeah, and that might not, you might not want to, that might not be the greatest. I agree with what you're saying as a Christian. You may not, you probably wouldn't have much success making that argument to that point with an atheist, but if you can at least undercut the argument that is proposed here, that an all-powerful God or an all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering, that's really all we need to do. But you're right. And so I think we've successfully undercut the argument that, God's existence is logically inconsistent with the existence of suffering just by saying that there could just be an overriding, the suffering that is there could contribute to some sort of overriding good, whatever that might be. If that's possible, we've undercut the argument. What we've not done is, offer an explanation for the suffering in the world. That is actually, that would be the evidential problem that we'll talk about next. But all we're doing here is undercutting this claim that an all-powerful God could create any world that he wanted to, a world, without suffering, and that an all-loving God would create such a world. We want to undercut those two assumptions, and I think we can do that pretty simply with what we've discussed. We can show that those two assumptions aren't necessarily true, and so there is no logical inconsistency in the existence of God and the existence of suffering in the actual world. So the atheist or anyone, anyone just for who might be arguing, who would make this argument it has to assume the burden of proof, and I don't really see how they could sustain it. This person would have to show that it's impossible that a world with suffering is better than a world without suffering, and no one has ever successfully done that I'm aware of. And frankly, I don't think, although I think this argument has been brought up in history, I don't think anyone actually tries to make this argument anymore. But it's still important to see the distinctions between this logical version and then the evidential argument that we'll be discussing. We'll discuss that next week. Because it's important, because what will often happen is that if you're talking with someone and they'll say something to the effect, and this is that quote that I remember Lex Luthor doing it in the Batman versus Superman movie, but it's very common to hear someone say God can't, followed by can't be all good or be all powerful because of some reason or another. But then they'll slide right into evidential arguments like God can't be all good because there's suffering in the world, or God can't be all powerful because even if he did create a world, he created a world where there's pain and suffering and all these terrible things. So what they're really saying is that if God has these attributes of being all powerful, of being all loving, then it's improbable that he exists given the amount of suffering and whatever else is in the world. So that's not a logical problem. That's an evidential problem, or a probabilistic problem. And so that's what we'll be discussing next week. Next week we're going to discuss the other version, we're talking about the intellectual problem of evil, and we're breaking that down into the logical, problem of suffering and the evidential problem of suffering. What we've discussed today is the logical problem. Next week we'll talk about the evidential problem of suffering, and that's where we'll get into what might be, what could be, we don't know, but what could be some good reasons that God has for permitting the suffering in the world. We've already said that it's possible that God allows suffering for some overriding good, and that's all we would need really to show to defeat the logical problem of evil. But what might those reasons be? So much of the suffering in the world, again, just from our perspective, it just appears to be unnecessary. It just appears to be meaningless, and that God could have just created a world without this particular sort of suffering, even if we did have other kinds of suffering. That's a much more powerful version of the argument in support of atheism. The burden on the atheist in that argument is much lighter, because they're not saying there's a logical incompatibility or inconsistency. They're just saying, they're effectively just saying, if your God exists, why do earthquakes happen? Why do buildings fall and crush children and men and women of, regardless of, just innocent people? And that's a much more powerful version of the argument, and that's the one you're most likely to encounter, and maybe the one that would just pop up in your own mind, thinking about things on your own. And so responding to this particular objection, or this version, is what we'll talk about next week. I'm going to stop there. If you guys have any questions or anything else to bring up.
I think since he gave us free will, he also let the elements have sort of free will. Let them work naturally. He didn't do anything to change how they're going to react naturally in the world. And therefore, if certain chemicals get together, certain things are going to happen, which would cause earthquakes or tsunamis or rain. That's the natural way of life. And he made it that way so we can have a natural way of life.
Yeah.
Maybe the beauty of the world maybe it's necessary for those kinds of things to happen so that we can have this beautiful world, the beauty of the world.
I agree with both of you guys. I mean, that's kind of the way I actually have thought about this. I've thought,
Mountains are gorgeous.
But
they do fall on people.
Right. The world shifts. You got tectonic plates and stuff, and a lot of times that goes unnoticed to us, but other times it causes catastrophic events on the surface of the world, and we experience different things. But I've actually thought, it's the same thing. I've thought, maybe when we get to this perfect, life, what we would call heaven, but we live in the world, we're still physical beings. Maybe all of these things that we encounter, that we call natural disasters, will still be occurring, but for however it works, we'll just be safe from them. That sort of thing. I've wondered, I don't know if that's true, but that's kind of what you guys are getting at, that the world just operates according to these certain natural laws and stuff. And why think that that'll go away, but maybe we're just in this position due to our closeness with God and the whole glorified state that Jesus, displayed after his death, burial, and resurrection. What if it's just that we're not susceptible to the suffering that those things do sometimes cause us? So I like where your heads are at. I don't know if that's how it'll work, but I think that's a good one. That's kind of the one that I've thought about too, rather than God just, because then you could say, well, these things are just the world behaves, but because of where we are in our relationship with God, and maybe that's one of the reasons whatever the reasons he might have permitted this temporary time of suffering, these things affect us in these ways that cause suffering. I don't know, but I do. I think that's a possibility.
About the world having free will, I was thinking of, if you had nature changes.
Mm-hmm.
It's a constant changing thing, and that's part of its beauty.
Mm-hmm.
If everything was in a frozen state, the ocean wouldn't move, the mountains would
Mm-hmm.
stay exactly the same color, the trees would be the same. If there wasn't variety in nature,
Yeah.
there wouldn't be that beauty of nature.
Yeah.
And it's the changing of the earth that causes a lot of those
Sure.
problems that we're talking about that
Right.
cause suffering.
Yeah. I think that's what we've been talking about here. Yeah, I think that's good. I know I didn't know this until I was reading for this lesson, but I guess at some point Alvin Plantinga, he just used this as an example. He's a philosopher. I've mentioned it here a couple of times. He is a theist, though. He just used it as an example for the argument, not that he believes this, but he said, it could be the case that there are spiritual beings at play, other spiritual beings, which I believe your Bible believes they exist, that have chosen to, not align themselves with God, like fallen angels or demons or that sort of thing, and that they cause natural disasters. He's like, what if these spiritual beings that are invisible to us, who also have free will and who have also chose to go against God's desires, are just, wreaking havoc on the world, which in turn causes a lot of destructive things that cause suffering to humans. It's possible. It's conjecture, but it's possible. But anyway, that just popped into my head. Sorry. So. Anything else? We good? I didn't see our clock. That is a world clock, so it does respond to. However those things work. I really. I don't know who it was. I think somebody felt sorry for us because they brought this clock in.
Oh.
Somebody, and this is a world clock too, but at least it wouldn't have,
I think that was the one that was upstairs.
demonically possessed hands that spin around. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Good to see you.